Hi everyone. So today we're going to be talking about our project, which is studying public trust in the EU and AU. To give a quick rundown of how this presentation is going to go, we're first going to talk about issues of trust in the European Union, then we'll talk about some policy proposals for the European Union, then we'll move on to the African Union, and similar to the European Union, we'll discuss some policy proposals there as well. First up, I'm going to turn it over to Vita, and she's going to talk about some issues in the European Union.
Thanks, George. So the public trust crisis, which is characterized by the public losing trust in the EU, has started in 2009. And as you can see in the graph on the left, this is the year when the majority of people in the EU express the sentiment that they tend not to trust the European Union. So there are a couple of intertwined reasons that have caused the emergence of this popular sentiment. So firstly, the sovereign debt crisis and euro crisis in 2009. So the distrust in the EU decision-making progress was exaggerated by the expensive bailout program for fiscally irresponsible countries such as Greece as a result of the sovereign debt crisis. And this period revealed the inherent flaws of the Eurozone. It showed that the Eurozone did not have enough fiscal integration and risk-sharing mechanisms with fiscal transfers that would allow to prevent the asymmetric shocks. But also the Eurozone did not share correlated business cycles, which made the Eurozone countries particularly susceptible to the asymmetric economic shocks. The second crisis that pursued was the European migrant crisis in 2015. And as the numbers of refugees coming across the Mediterranean increase, countries in the EU had to accept migrant quotas. And in combination with the economic shocks following back the 2009 economic crisis, the European migrant crisis has resulted in the anti-immigration, anti-EU nationalist narrative that was particularly exploited by the populist leaders. And the situation engendered distrust amongst the EU citizens who believe that the progressive values such as cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism promoted by the EU inherently threatened the national identity and interest of a sovereign EU member state. And lastly, the economic insecurity also tremendously contributed to the increasing distrust in the EU. The popular opinion was that the supranational institution was responsible for subjecting its member states to the global economic competition. And the EU has been blamed by the populist anti-EU political parties for subjecting its member states to either globalization or technological progress, which in the form of increased competition from the low-wage countries and automation. And of course, the climax of the distrust in the EU was the Brexit vote in 2016, and it really revealed the potency of Euroscepticism within this union.
All right, thank you, Vita. So I want to dive in a little bit more on what we identify as a key issue, which is populist autocratic governments, especially in Central Europe. Specifically, we're focused on Hungary and Poland. Where in Hungary, there's Viktor Orbán and his party, which first came to power in 2010, and what they've been doing is undermining courts and media independence, as well as disregarding various obligations of the EU, such as the EU Court of Justice rulings on migrant policy. In Poland, this issue's been come from Andrzej Duda and the Law and Justice Party, who were first elected in 2015 on a lot of anti-migrant sentiment, and they've similarly been undermining courts and media independence. Specifically in Poland, they've changed the process for selecting judges on the highest court in Poland, giving the ruling party considerably more input on the application of the law. And they've also been in violation of EU obligations of women's and LGBT rights. Now, this issue has come to a head and threatened consequences for the broader EU Late last year, there was a budget standoff. In this essence, what happens is that the European Union, every 5 to 7 years, needs to make a long-term budgetary framework. And what happens is that around the same time, the European Parliament wished to attach conditions to European Union funding for coronavirus stimulus to meeting obligations such as respecting the Court of Justice and upholding rule of law. In response, Hungary and Poland threatened to veto that long-term budget request, and because it needs to pass unanimously, they have considerable power to do so, and a deadlock ensued. Eventually, that was negotiated out of that, but nonetheless, this was a very much ground the process to a halt, and definitely governments not playing by the rules, disregarding rulings, and then gumming up the works when it comes to making long-term important decisions is probably the largest effect of this issue on the EU at the moment. So let's pivot some policy recommendations. What can the EU do to solve this issue? And first thing they should do is tackle the rule of law issue. Specifically with these populist autocratic governments, they should really take a harder stance towards them. So the first part of that would be to amend a 2020 report that was issued on the rule of law throughout the EU. This report was criticized for having naive and weak language and not connecting the dots on what the issue really is in Hungary and Poland. This would prevent Hungary and Poland from deflecting attention from the issue and pointing to other countries, and also reestablish some credibility of the European Commission, which issued the reports. Specifically, the European Commission needs to show that it's not sleeping on the job here and is actively watching out for rule of law in the European Union. The second thing they should do is to use the new conditionality mechanisms that result in the EU budget standoff to then potentially, impose costs on the Polish and Hungarian leadership for undermining rule of law. This chart on the right explains the mechanism how that would work. You can see this explains which EU countries are net beneficiaries and contributors to the European Union budget. And as you can see, the bottom two countries are Hungary and Poland. So the European Union has considerable leverage here in terms of the funding mechanism to change the political calculus of the Polish and Hungarian leadership. And this could be a very good path forward because Hungarian and Polish leadership are in a fairly fragile position, actually. While they may have ridden populist, anti-migrants, economically populist, Eurosceptic rhetoric and feelings to power, their country's politics are deeply polarized, and there's been popularity has declined. Having European Union funding cut off from their countries because of their actions on the rule of law issue would certainly make them less popular. And with snap elections coming up in Poland and Hungary's presidential election coming up next year, this could be a pretty opportune moment for the European Union to impose some costs on them and change political calculus of these leaders. Next up, I'm going to turn over to Vita, and she's going to talk about some economic front stuff.
Yes. So as we can see, the decreasing the political appeal of a populist, Eurosceptic political parties is essential to increase the popular support for the European Union. So we believe that the EU should pursue two main policy changes. First, in terms of economic policy, and secondly, improving the communication and representation of the EU citizens. Next slide, please. So we believe that economic policy changes are vital. So firstly, we believe that the EU should really tackle the unemployment problem. And so currently the European Commission has established the European Social Fund that seeks to open the pathways to work for EU citizens who struggle to find employment. However, the problem is that only half of the unemployed people in the European Union take advantage of these funds. So we recommend the EU to expand the European Social Fund program and make it more accessible to all the people who are unable to find employment under the status quo. Secondly, we believe that allocation of the EU structural and cohesion funds can also be a very powerful drive encouraging more public trust in the supranational organization. So the promotion of infrastructural projects, which are usually funded by these EU structural and cohesion funds, do not directly translate to the high levels of support and trust in the EU, because these infrastructural investments are not that visible to an average voter. Hence, we believe that the EU should invest more and allocate more of these funds to personal development of the EU citizens, such as funding retraining programs and education programs, rather than purely investing only to infrastructure. And secondly, we recommend the EU to strive for the greater extent of fiscal integration within the Union. So the EU has to ensure a broader economic recovery and lower debt levels across the EU, especially the Eurozone, through a means of greater fiscal integration in order to prevent the asymmetric economic shocks within the Union that are the main catalyst for the populist, Eurosceptic political forces that threaten the cohesion within the Union. So as fiscal integration is often perceived as exceptionally politically sensitive issue, we recommend that the EU should first approach this question by encouraging uncontroversial policy changes, such as privatization of loss-making national companies, and this way making its member states more fiscally responsible. Next slide, please. And lastly, we recommend that the EU improve its communication and representation of its citizens. And firstly, we believe that the EU should really focus more on communicating better its success stories, such as prompt agreement on the COVID relief package for all the member states. Because we feel that the EU gets a lot of negative coverage for all of the crises it has faced throughout the years, and all of the problems it has to in its decision-making process. So I think it's very important to counterweight that with the success stories. And secondly, we believe that the EU should encourage citizens' engagement in the EU decision-making process. So we believe that the EU should promote greater political engagement of the EU citizens through the means of direct democracy. So the EU could effectively deal with its alleged economic deficit that enable the populist Eurosceptic political parties to villainize the EU. So the supranational institution could call for binding or non-binding referenda on the EU internal issues to be held in all member states, following the similar Swiss practice. And secondly, most importantly, we advise the EU to practice participatory budgeting initiative. So this initiative of a participatory budget has been successfully implemented in 9 Polish municipalities and has resulted in greater trust in the mechanisms of representative democracy and its ability to translate public wishes into action. Hence, the EU should seek to implement similar practices of participatory budgeting when determining the allocation of its structural or cohesion funds to the member states in order to encourage the EU citizens participation in the decision-making process and making them feel as they have a say in this international organization. Now I would like to pass on Andrea to talk more about the African Union.
Alrighty, so now we'll be moving on to the African Union. Just a little bit of background. The African Union was formed in 2002 after the collapse of the Organization for African Unity. The African Union was established with the goal of promoting the integration and evolution of the continent, with its citizens playing an active role in social, political, and economic development. Unfortunately, what we've seen happen 20 years later is that the African Union is still plagued by the problems of its predecessors, leading to a decrease in trust. Next slide, please. 50% of Africans surveyed say they think the African Union plays a positive or somewhat positive role in their country, whilst 13% of Africans surveyed believe that the influence of the African Union on their country is negative, demonstrating this erosion of trust in the African Union. And we believe that it's currently suffering from a loss of legitimacy amongst African citizens due to the fact that the African Union is a democratic organization. However, it is governed by dictators who often eschew democratic procedures, and that prevents the EU from acting in situations where democracy has been breached. There's also this dependence on Western states for aid. So the African Union is primarily funded by Western organizations, which means that a lot of people feel like the prerogative of the African Union is influenced by the donors, as well as this high level of division between member states. Furthermore, this failure to deliver on their mandates and a disconnect between what citizens expect of the African Union versus its actions on the ground have led to a trust in this organization. Next slide.
So to expand on Andrea's third point about the high level of division amongst AU member states and the AU's inaction on member states' human rights violations, we want to point out that this high level of division and inaction is most salient in interethnic conflicts. For instance, since 2016, there has been ongoing civil unrest in Cameroon's northwest and southwest regions. The conflict began when English-speaking regions declared independence symbolically from the state. This occurred under the context of decades of Camerooni authorities' marginalization of English-speaking populations. In recent years, in particular, the government suppressed Anglophone groups' protests over intensified marginalization of Anglophone institutions in the country, and tensions have become violent. So Camerooni authorities and the government have repeatedly rejected civil society's reports on the killing of protesters and grave human rights violations committed by government forces. According to experts, the AU had several tools that it could have used to respond to this crisis. First, imposing sanctions on Cameroon. Second, revoking Cameroon's membership in the AU. And third, appointing a UN and AU special rapporteur or representative to conduct a truth-finding mission on the ground. However, the AU has largely stayed silent. Notably, the Peace and Security Council, which is the AU's decision-making group on the prevention and resolution of conflicts, and which is supposed to facilitate timely and efficient response to conflict and crisis situations in Africa, has largely stayed silent on the issue as well. And at the UN Security Council, several AU member states blocked a formal introduction of the situation in Cameroon to the Security Council's agenda. We want to point out that many states in the AU have presumably stayed silent or refrained from taking action because they share similar concerns about independence movements within their own borders and therefore do not support the independence movement. The AU also emphasizes the principle of territorial integrity and the inviolability of borders. So to conclude, the AU's lack of action on the situation in Cameroon, which is largely informed by its member states' preferences, has contradicted its mandate for the advancement of democratic principles and institutions and the protection of human rights.
Moving on to our policy recommendations, the African Union, again, as earlier stated, was formed with the goal of actively including citizens within its mandates and having citizens play an active role in the development of the continent. However, that has not happened. And so what we propose is a restructuring of the African Union. So the establishment of a democratically elected AU parliament will restore trust by encouraging participation amongst African citizens in the African Union, whilst also combating corruption and increasing transparency of the organization. And in return, the Parliament of the African Union can engage with citizens to further promote this transparency. We also suggest the creation of exception cases for intervention in crises and an AU task force that will allow for a more efficient response to crises across the continent. Next slide, please.
So to restore the public's confidence in the AU's mandate to protect human rights in the region, we focus on two overarching objectives in our policy proposals. First, to improve the independence of regional human rights institutions from states' interference, and second, to ensure individuals' access to justice and accountability. These two objectives both seek to strengthen existing regional human rights institutions, particularly individuals and the global community's access and engagement in these institutions. So for the first objective, ensuring the autonomy of the two regional human rights focused institutions, which are the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and the African Court on Human and People's Rights, we have three specific proposals. First, the African Union Commission, which is the Secretary of the African Union, should discourage and restrain member states from interfering in these two institutions' operations. The two institutions are designed to function independently, as the commissioners and judges in the two institutions are supposed to be legal experts who do not represent any national interests. In 2018, the AU Executive Council, which consists of foreign ministers of member states, issued two decisions that severely restricted the Commission's independence and role, as well as civil society's participation in the Commission's work. The elimination of political interference from AU member states is very important for holding member states' governments and authorities accountable and to protect AU member state citizens' human rights. We think that out of all AU bodies, the AU Commission is the most well positioned to strive for this objective because it initiates proposals to be submitted to the AU's organs and guides and monitors the AU's overall performance to ensure conformity with agreed upon policies and strategies. So it is in the best position to point out how such policies of interfering in the autonomy of regional human rights institutions runs counter to the AU's overall mandates. Second, the AU Commission should facilitate strengthening cooperation between the Commission and the International Criminal Court in their investigation and the court's prosecution responsibilities. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights has three monitoring procedures. First, state parties to the African Charter need to submit periodic self-reports to a commission every 2 years. Second, states can also file a complaint on another state party's violations of the Charter to the AU Secretary General and the chairperson of the commission. And third, most importantly, individuals can also file a complaint on a state party's violation of the African Charter to the Commission. With information gained from these mechanisms, we think that the AU Commission and the Commission on Human and People's Rights can support the ICC's investigation work. And third, the AU Commission should also facilitate strengthening cooperation between the Commission and multilateral human rights institutions like the UN Human Rights Treaty-based bodies and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The African Commission's three mechanisms offer information about states' violations of their obligations, and by working more closely with multilateral human rights institutions, the African Commission can provide more information to these multilateral institutions to be used in their reporting procedures. This helps the investigation of human rights violations and enhancement of the availability and transparency of credible information on human rights violations. Next slide, please. For the second objective, improving individuals' access to justice, we have two proposals. First, the AU Commission should enhance citizens' awareness of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights individual complaints procedures. Specifically, the AU Commission can work with the Commission on Human and People's Rights and also human rights non-governmental organizations to produce guides for explaining the human rights and essential freedoms detailed in the Charter, the Commission's individual complaints process, how to file a complaint, and how to seek assistance and resources for filing complaints. The AU Commission should then actively try to disseminate these materials through the AU's online presence and encourage member states to distribute these material to their citizens. As much as awareness is very important, the ability to access the individual complaints procedure is equally, if not more important. The AU should also ensure a consistent allocation of its budget to the Legal Aid Fund of Human Rights Organs of the AU to ensure that individuals looking to file complaints have access to legal representation. This was actually a major part of the statute which established the Legal Aid Fund that was adopted by the AU in January 2016. The AU Commission, with its responsibility to oversee the AU's budget allocation and supervision of AU organs, should actively try to bring this item to the AU's agenda when it's considering its budgets every year.
So, brings us to the conclusion of our presentation. So the overall conclusion, takeaway is that both the EU and AU have public trust issues. However, the underlying causes are very unique to each institution. There's no one-size-fits-all approach here. However, there are some general areas we can talk about improvements, such as demonstrating competence, such as the European Union on human rights issue, on the rule of law issue, and the African Union on human rights issues, and communicating effectively, such as the European Union explaining what it does for people, and the African Union explaining the mechanisms for human rights, and also improving representation, such as participatory budgeting in the EU and the AU Parliament. I want to thank you for your time, and I hope this presentation was helpful.